You are absolutely certain you know where you were when you heard the news about the Challenger. You remember the morning with unusual clarity. You remember the room, the people around you, the exact moment the information arrived. Memory like this has a specific texture. It feels recorded rather than recalled, crystallized, unalterable. You'd stake your credibility on it. Ulric Neisser, a cognitive psychologist at Cornell University, ran the study in 1989. The day after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, January 28, 1986, he handed 106 college students a questionnaire. Where were you when you heard? Who were you with? What were you doing? How did you feel? They answered in detail. The questionnaire went into a drawer. 3 years later, Neisser brought them back. He asked the same questions. He then compared their new answers against their original ones, the ones they'd written the morning after. The results were extraordinary in a deeply uncomfortable way. 25% of students gave accounts that contradicted their original statements on every major detail: location, companions, activity, emotional reaction, all of it wrong. 45% had accounts that matched only partially. Just under a third came close to their original statements. When students were shown their own handwriting from 3 years earlier, proof of what they'd actually written, a common response was disbelief. One participant insisted the original questionnaire must be wrong. Here's the detail that makes this more than an academic finding. Confidence correlated inversely with accuracy. The more vividly certain a person was about their memory, the more likely it was to be wrong. The feeling of clarity, that crystalline, recorded not recalled quality, was not a reliability signal. It was noise. Neisser named this phenomenon the flashbulb memory. The intense emotional charge of a significant event doesn't preserve the memory, it preserves the feeling of having a memory. The emotional intensity of the moment essentially overexposes the frame. What survives is the certainty, not the content. The thing you can picture with perfect resolution right now, where you were, what you were doing, the precise moment something important arrived, is almost certainly a reconstruction. Your brain assembled it later, from fragments, from narrative logic, from what makes sense given everything else you know, and then it handed it back to you labeled verified. Tired, rest, awake, dream, bed, nap, slumber, drowsy, night, pillow, snooze, blanket, yawn. Now look away. James Dease at Johns Hopkins ran the original version of this experiment in 1959. Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott at Rice University replicated and refined it in 1995. The study has since been reproduced thousands of times across dozens of languages and cultures. It is one of the most robust findings in memory research. The finding is this. After reading a list of words that cluster around a central concept, like the one above, between 40 and 55% of participants will later recall a word that was never on the list, a word that is semantically related to the cluster but absent from the actual sequence. They don't guess it as something they might have read, they report it as something they definitely read. In the list above, the word is sleep. It wasn't there. Check again if you want. The mechanism Roediger and McDermott identified is called the DRM paradigm, after all three researchers' names. Your brain doesn't store words, it stores meaning networks. When you read tired, rest, awake, dream, bed, your brain activates the semantic hub at the center of that network, and sleep sits precisely at that hub. Your memory system, attempting to be efficient, encodes the gist and the central concept, and later retrieves the central concept as if it were the specific input. The unsettling part isn't that you misremember, it's that the false memory feels identical to the accurate one from the inside. When participants in DRM studies are asked how confident they are about a remembered word, they rate false memories at the same confidence level as accurate ones. The subjective experience of remembering something correctly and the subjective experience of remembering something that never happened are, neurologically, the same experience. Your memory doesn't flag its errors. It doesn't come with an uncertainty indicator. Every memory arrives feeling equally real. You're watching a short film. Two cars meet at an intersection. There's a collision. After the film, you're asked, how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? Or, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Or, how fast were they going when they smashed into each other? Elizabeth Loftus ran this experiment at the University of Washington in 1974. She showed subjects the same collision footage and then asked the speed question using different verbs: contacted, hit, bumped, collided, smashed, across different groups. The verb choice changed the estimated speed. Contacted produced an average estimate of 31.8 miles per hour. Smashed produced an average of 40.8 miles per hour. Same film, same collision, 9 miles per hour of difference from a single word. Then Loftus waited a week and brought subjects back for a second question. She asked, "Did you see any broken glass?" There was no broken glass in the film, but subjects who had been asked about the smashed collision were more than twice as likely to report seeing broken glass that did not exist. The word smashed hadn't merely changed how they described the speed, it had retroactively edited the film they remembered watching. Loftus went on to spend decades documenting what she named the misinformation effect. Information received after an event systematically distorts the stored memory of that event. Questions, summaries, casual conversations, news reports, anything that arrives after the original experience can rewrite the record. The brain doesn't store memories in a vault and retrieve them intact. It reconstructs them on demand, and that reconstruction process incorporates everything that has arrived since the original event, including the way someone phrased a question to you. The legal implications of Loftus's work were so significant that they eventually helped reshape how eyewitness testimony is evaluated in courtrooms. But the personal implications are the ones that stay with you. Every time someone has asked you about something you witnessed, every time you've described an event in conversation, every time you've thought about a memory, you may have been revising it. The file is not read-only. Every time you open it, you can accidentally overwrite it. You've never broken a window with your hand. You're fairly sure of this. It's the kind of thing you would remember. Marianne Garry at Victoria University of Wellington ran the study in 1996. She brought subjects into a lab and asked them a simple question. On a scale of 1 to 8, how likely is it that you ever broke a window with your hand as a child? Subjects answered, and then they went through an unrelated 2-week period during which they were asked to mentally imagine a number of childhood scenarios, some real, some invented. 2 weeks later, Garry brought them back and asked the same question again. Subjects who had been asked to mentally visualize breaking a window during those 2 weeks were significantly more likely to rate it as probably happened on the second questionnaire, even though nothing had occurred between the first and second sessions except that they had imagined it. The act of vivid imagination had slightly but measurably shifted their assessment of whether the event had actually taken place. Garry named this imagination inflation. The mechanism is a specific failure of what cognitive psychologists call source monitoring, your brain's ability to track where information came from. When you retrieve a mental image, your brain checks it against a "did this happen" tag. But imagination and memory produce similar neural activation patterns. When you imagine something vividly enough, repeatedly enough, The source tag degrades. The image begins to feel less like something you constructed and more like something you accessed. This isn't a rare malfunction. Garry and her colleague, Kimberly Wade, subsequently showed that subjects could be induced to remember riding in a hot air balloon as a child after being shown a doctored family photograph that placed them in one. The photograph created the source tag. The memory followed. The photographs in your own family albums are not neutral records. Every time you've looked at them, you've been building a memory that may be partly the photo, partly the caption, partly the story someone told you about it, and very little of the actual moment. You read something in a book, or did someone tell you, or did you figure it out yourself, or did you dream it? 3 weeks later, you cannot tell. Marcia Johnson at Yale University spent years documenting what she called source monitoring, the brain system for tracking not just what you know, but where you learned it. Her research, conducted across the late 1980s and 1990s and synthesized in a landmark review in 1993, established something that should make you re-examine every confident attribution you've ever made. Your brain stores the content of a memory and the source of a memory as separate information, maintained with different levels of reliability. Content, what you know, holds its structure relatively well. Source, how you know it, degrades quickly, and it degrades unevenly. After approximately 3 weeks, you can no longer reliably distinguish between things you read, things you heard, things you experienced, and things you imagined. The failure is asymmetric in a predictable direction. You systematically upgrade sources. Something you heard becomes something you read. Something you read becomes something you studied. Something you imagined becomes something you experienced. Each step up the source hierarchy adds subjective credibility. Your brain rounds up. Johnson showed this across multiple experimental designs. Subjects who had been asked to imagine performing an action were, weeks later, likely to report having actually performed it. Subjects who had heard information from an unreliable source were likely to later attribute it to a reliable one. The source degradation isn't random noise. It trends toward whatever makes the information feel more legitimate. The idea you're about to share in a meeting, the one you feel confident you developed yourself, you may have read it last month and simply lost the provenance. The belief you hold about your own history, the reason you became the person you are, may be a story someone else told you about yourself, stripped of its authorship by time. You don't just forget things, you forget where they came from, and then you reattribute them. You are 45 minutes into a colonoscopy. It is uncomfortable. It has been uncomfortable for 45 minutes, consistently and predictably. And then, in the final 2 minutes, the discomfort drops, still present, but noticeably, measurably less than the 43 minutes before it. You rate the experience afterward. How bad was it? Daniel Kahneman, at the time at the University of California, Berkeley, ran this study in 1996 with physician Donald Redelmeier. They recruited 682 patients undergoing colonoscopies and monitored their pain reports in real time. Every 60 seconds, subjects pressed a rating scale to indicate current discomfort. At the end of the procedure, they were asked to rate the overall experience. The results overturned the intuitive logic of how memory works. Patients who had a longer procedure but whose final moments were less intense than their peak remembered the procedure as significantly less painful than patients who had shorter procedures with higher final moment discomfort. The patients whose total pain duration was greater but whose ending was gentler rated the entire experience as better than patients who had suffered less but finished at a higher intensity. Your memory is not averaging your experience. It is sampling 2 moments, the peak intensity and the final moments, and discarding everything between. Kahneman named this the peak-end rule. Duration neglect is the companion finding. The length of an experience has almost no effect on how you remember it. A 90-minute film that peaks at a devastating moment and ends badly will be remembered as worse than a 90-minute film that peaks at the same moment but ends well, even if both films had identical total emotional content. A conversation that ends with an awkward silence will be remembered as more uncomfortable than a longer conversation with worse moments but a warm conclusion. Your memory is not a recording device, it is an editor, and it has a specific bias. It cares about endings and peaks and almost nothing else. The ordinary middle, most of your actual experience, is filed under unimportant and quietly discarded. You cannot remember what you had for lunch 3 Tuesdays ago, but you can remember with frustrating clarity every task on that project you never quite finished. Bluma Zeigarnik was a Lithuanian psychologist studying in Berlin in 1927 when she noticed that her professor, Kurt Levin, and later her own experimental subjects could remember interrupted tasks significantly better than completed ones. She ran a systematic study. Subjects were given 22 small tasks, puzzles, riddles, assembly problems. Half were allowed to complete them. Half were interrupted mid-task. After the session, subjects were asked to recall the tasks. They remembered the interrupted ones at nearly twice the rate of the completed ones. The unfinished business created a memory trace that the finished business did not. The brain held open loops open. The Zeigarnik effect entered psychological canon and has been confirmed and replicated extensively. But the modern inversion is equally documented and far less discussed. Completed tasks are actively cleared. Your brain is not a neutral archive. It is a task management system with a very specific directive. Hold on to what's unresolved and release what's done. When a task reaches completion, the cognitive tension that maintained it dissolves, and the memory begins to decay at an accelerated rate. This is efficient. This is also why you cannot remember most of what you actually did last week. Research building on Zeigarnik's foundation, particularly work by John Atkinson in the 1950s and subsequent studies on completion-based forgetting, has confirmed that the act of closure is the beginning of forgetting. Every email you sent, every item you crossed off your list, every conversation that reached its resolution, your brain filed those as done and quietly began deprioritizing them. The things that define you, the achievements, the resolved moments, the finished work, are, by the exact mechanism that makes you functional, the things your memory treats as least worth keeping. You were there. You looked directly at the person. You were paying close attention because something had already gone wrong. You had no reason to lie and no reason to be confused. You were wrong anyway. Christian Meissner at Iowa State University and John Brigham at Florida State University conducted a landmark meta-analysis in 2001, reviewing 30 years of research on the cross-race effect in eyewitness identification. They analyzed 39 studies involving over 5,000 subjects and produced a precise number. People are 1.56 times more likely to correctly identify a face of their own racial or ethnic group than a face of a different group. The effect holds across groups in both directions. It is not a bias in the sense of intention or prejudice. It is a bias in the sense of training data. Your brain's face recognition system was calibrated on the faces it encountered most frequently during development, and it applies those calibrations universally, regardless of match. The Innocence Project, which has used DNA evidence to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals since 1992, has cataloged the downstream consequences of this. As of their most recent database review, mistaken eyewitness identification has been a contributing factor in approximately 69% of wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence. In cases involving cross-race identification, the misidentification rates are disproportionately higher. These are not stupid people, not careless people, not people trying to harm anyone. These are people who looked directly at a face during a high-stress moment and coded it with sincere attention and later reported it in good faith. Their confidence was genuine, their certainty was complete, their memory was wrong in a way they had no mechanism to detect. You cannot feel the calibration bias in your own face recognition. You experience your identifications as identifications, not as estimations. The confidence you feel is not a reliability signal. It is a feature of the system, regardless of accuracy. George Harrison wrote My Sweet Lord in 1970. He sat down and wrote it. He was conscious, sober, and sincerely creating something he believed was his own. The melody was He's So Fine, recorded by the Chiffons in 1963. In the 1976 copyright case, Bright Tunes Music Corp. v. Harrisongs, federal judge Richard Owen ruled that Harrison had not deliberately plagiarized. The finding was something more unsettling. Harrison had subconsciously absorbed the earlier melody, stored it without a source tag, and later accessed it as an original composition. The plagiarism was not intentional, it was architectural. The phenomenon is called Cryptomnesia, from the Greek for hidden memory. The psychologist Theodore Flournoy documented early cases in the early 1900s, and subsequent researchers, including Alan Brown at Southern Methodist University and Dana Murphy, have studied it experimentally. The consistent finding is that forgotten memories do not disappear. They lose their source attribution. They become anonymous content, floating in memory without a label reading borrowed. When you later access that content in a generative context, writing, problem-solving, brainstorming, it arrives feeling like original output because it is output. The fact that it arrived into your mind from somewhere else was the piece that failed to make the journey. Harrison was not the first artist to have this happen, and studies by Brown have documented it occurring in everyday contexts. Subjects who generated ideas in group brainstorming sessions would, weeks later, rediscover their ideas in their notes, ideas that had originally come from other participants, stored and returned without attribution. The line between remembering and creating is thinner than the feeling of creativity suggests. Your most original thought might be someone else's, filed under your name by a storage system that stopped tracking provenance. If you are over 40 and someone asks you to name 10 memories, real, specific, vivid ones, notice where they cluster. They are probably from between the ages of 15 and 25. David Rubin at Duke University and Matthew Schulkind ran a series of studies in 1997 using the method of cued autobiographical recall, giving subjects single words and asking them to name the first specific personal memory that the word evoked. When they mapped the ages associated with those memories across hundreds of participants over 40, the distribution was not even. It peaked sharply in the 15 to 25 range. They named this the reminiscence bump. The explanation is not that more happened during those years. It is that your brain treats novelty differently from repetition. Between 15 and 25, almost everything is a first. First love, first independence, first political understanding, first sense of who you are rather than who you've been told to be. Novel experiences are encoded with a flag that says significant. Repeated experiences, the 10,000 mornings of your adult life, the recurring rhythms of work and routine, are encoded with diminishing marginal detail. Eventually, the routine is encoded as the category, not the instance. After 25, most people's lives become, by the brain's accounting, substantially the same day repeated. Not because nothing happens, things happen constantly, but because the brain has a template now, and it is no longer filing the days individually. It is filing them as another Tuesday and discarding the specifics. Rubin and Schulkind also found that the bump is not smaller for people who had objectively eventful lives after 25. Career changes, marriages, children, losses, these are encoded and remembered, but they do not displace the adolescent peak. They exist alongside it, remembered less vividly, retrieved less reliably. You are living your life now in real time, with all its weight and detail. Your brain is quietly deciding which parts are worth keeping. It is, on the whole, opting not to.